As the world begins to emerge from the cave of the 21st century and opens its eyes onto the suffering from centuries of injustice and the bastardization of what it means to be free, the New Nomos podcast is a call for a new beginning, a call for the new men and the new women that yearn to be truly free, a call for us to fulfill our destiny, a call for a new Nomos on the earth. Welcome to the New Nomos podcast. I'm Abdallah Datan, inviting you to join me on this journey of discovery, to define what the New Nomos is and what we need to get there. Hello and welcome to another episode of the New Nomos podcast. This episode is with Edward Chessun, who is an English teacher, a writer, and a lover of poetry, and in particular the Irish poet W.B Yeats, who is the subject of this conversation. So, without further ado, I present to you episode 34, Tragic Joy, W.B Yeats and On Bailey's Strand.
Well, at university I did my dissertation on Yeats and Nietzsche, on the Irish national poet and the German philosopher.
What was the title?
So it was something like Yeats's reading of Nietzsche, The Case of On Bailey's Strand. And so it was specifically about one play that Yeats produced called On Bailey's Strand, which is about the mythical hero of Ireland, Cuchulainn, and how Yeats was influenced by the birth of tragedy. So how the writing of that play was influenced by Nietzsche's first book, which is The Birth of Tragedy.
You were at university and you had
Yes.
to choose a dissertation to write,
We could come up with anything like most students at university.
and you were studying literature.
Yes, and history. So it had to be something to do with literature and something that was historical at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you obviously had a passion for Yeats,
Oh, of course.
and you
Yeah.
loved his poetry, and so you took this one play. I just want to know, like, what led you to doing your what led you down that path of research?
Well, I wanted to do something important with my dissertation. Obviously, this is the young undergraduate thinking, but I wanted to do something that was significant. And at the time, I was reading the 10 Symphonies of Gorka Konig. I think I read it in my last year of university.
Right.
And in the December of that year, I'd gone to Freiburg and I went hiking in the Black Forest. And I went to the hut where Heidegger lived, and he wrote "Being in Time." And in the editions of "Being in Time," it always says at the front title page, "Being in Time," and then underneath it says he wrote, like as if you'd write published in. He wrote Tottenauberg, Die Schwarzwald, 1927.
Oh.
You know, so he wanted it to be known that book, the place where the book was written, is the being and time, the place and the time.
Amazing.
Yeah. So I went there and I was full of it. So I just had to do something on Nietzsche or Heidegger, and I had all kinds of crazy ideas of different. It took a long time to get to that. It wasn't straightforward. I think most people can relate to that if they've written a dissertation at university.
Mm-hmm.
It was a long process of whittling down, throwing things, scrapping up, scrunching up bits of paper and chucking them in the paper bin. And then it got really, because it was only a short dissertation anyway, it's undergraduate dissertation.
Mm-hmm.
So it had to be it was quite frustrating how narrow it had to be. So I had to narrow it down until I found out a way to make it really sort of direct. And it was about, Yeats's play On Bailey's Strand, which is very rarely performed, actually. Most people don't know Yeats wrote plays, really. But one of the great projects of his life was to open a theatre in Dublin.
Amazing.
And then it was on that play and Nietzsche's book.
What's the play about?
So the play is about this mythical hero of Ireland, Cuchulainn.
All right.
And Cuchulainn was from Ulster, which has always been the land of the kings of Ireland. And he was this great warrior. And he was always in conflict with the older kings who were much they were much wiser than him, and he was much more virile than them.
Mm.
So there was always this kind of conflict, bitterness between the two of them. So in the play, a young man alights on the shore, lands on the shore from Scotland, and he comes onto the shore and he enters Cuchulainn's camp and he challenges Cuchulainn to fight. And Cuchulainn is outraged by this. He's absolutely outraged that someone would do this. But he's also outraged because he sees something in this boy that he hasn't seen in any of the other men that fight for him. He sees him as particularly special. He says to the kings that let him join my war band. The play begins with Cuchulainn and the king having a huge argument about Cuchulainn's this woman that Cuchulainn had when he was in Scotland, this king is saying she's not. Why won't you settle down and marry? He's saying to Cuchulainn, why won't you settle down and marry and become a proper king? Why are you and your war band just like the birds that just sort of migrate here and there and is causing mayhem across the country? Why won't you settle down? And he says, I will never settle down. Then he says, you were with this wild woman of the camp. And he goes, you call her a woman of the camp. You didn't see the passion in her eyes. You didn't see the wisdom. You didn't hear the wisdom in her words. You know nothing about her. And then it's like this head-on confrontation. And Cuchulainn abandoned this woman anyway. He did leave her. And he's back in Ireland, but he's still defending her. And then this young boy, he's a lad, he turns up. And the kings are saying that he has to be killed because he's a foreigner. And Cuchulainn's saying, no, let him join my men. And the king blocks it. So Cuchulainn then has to kill this boy. But it has to be a duel. It has to be fair. But obviously the boy doesn't really stand a chance. And then Cuchulainn finds out that boy was his son. And it was the son he had with that woman.
Oh.
And that he'd left her pregnant. And he had no idea. And that was his son and heir. And then Cuchulainn goes out into the waves on Bailey, because the Strand, he goes out from beyond the Strand into the waves with his sword, fighting the waves until he disappears and drowns as well. He's gone, completely gone under the ocean.
Whoa.
And Yeats saw this play as like the Oedipus story, but almost in reverse, because it was the father killing his son, rather than the son realizing that he's killed his father. And then he also gouges his eyes out in a way. He goes into the waves and he kills himself. And Yeats believed that the modern theatre at the time wasn't able to perform plays like this. It just wasn't able to, because the whole thing about it was geared up for musicals and pantomimes. And so the theatre audience were looking for musicals and pantomimes. But Yeats at the time, with Ezra Pound, had rediscovered the Japanese ancient theatre. I don't know how Pound came across these translations, but they were translations of no plays. And the no plays are all in verse, poetic. The actors wear masks, which makes it almost impossible for an actor to do what they want to do, which is express themselves.
Wow.
So the actors wear ritual masks.
Yeah.
There's hardly any movement on the stage. It's all symbolic movement. And the speech has to be in rhyme.
Ooh.
And so it actually removes all kind of individuality from the actor. Well, all the obvious ways to express your individuality.
Yeah.
But then, the plays always end up being these sort of symbolic tales or tragedy, like Japanese forms of tragedy, not Greek tragedy. But Yeats and Ezra Pound wanted to create a theatre house, or they even said this kind of play could be done. Yeats said, I want to revive the ancient theatre, like the theatre of Sophocles. And he said the ancient theatre can be done with just a robe around a man, with a staff on the floor, and maybe a tapestry behind him, and that's it. There doesn't need to be the lighting. There doesn't need to be the all the special effects, the backdrops, like the Victorian stages were really elaborate.
Yes.
And Yeats basically believed all of this took away from the simplicity of ancient theatre. And he found that the Japanese still had it in the modern day. They kept their medieval tradition, the Japanese no tradition, but that the Western theatre, which came from like Shakespeare, but then was a revival of an Elizabethan revival of what they thought the Greek theatre was like. So Yeats wanted to go back to the source, and he said that this play could be. He said these plays, I want them to be able to be performed. You could perform them in a drawing room, or on a stage, or under a tree.
Amazing.
Like it could be done anywhere, and all you would need was 3 actors and an audience, a small audience, and that'd be it. Because what was holding theatre companies back was they had to make money, they had to sell tickets to pay for all this stuff, all this special effects. And Yeats believed all of this took away from the original Greek theatres, which were like houses of worship almost.
Yeah.
They were houses of worship of the gods. Yeah. And the chorus sang as the tragedy was going on. And the plays were almost always tragedies, or they were comedies like Euripides. Otherwise, they were tragedies. And the god that they were evoking that came onto the stage or would possess the actor and the audience and the chorus at the same time, Dionysus.
Yeah.
So Dionysus is the god of intoxication. And Dionysus is what it's what Aristotle calls catharsis in poetics. So every English literature student from A levels knows about catharsis, because we all have to do a Shakespeare tragedy, probably Hamlet or Macbeth.
Right.
And then you have, or King Lear, and you have to know about Shakespeare's trying to create a cathartic moment.
Yes.
Yeah. But Yeats believed that catharsis was far more powerful than just this sort of, just a tragedy. It was a whole audience being united in one emotion, along with the chorus and the actors. So that's the Dionysian intoxication.
Wow.
You know, that's Dionysus.
Well, I understand that Greek tragedy was a social duty. The populace were almost obligated to go to watch the tragedies in order to cleanse them of their illnesses, so that they would be free from them and get this catharsis and then go back into society as healthier people.
Well, Yeats also believed that his theatre house would have a political effect, would perform a kind of a social duty.
Mm.
So he wanted an Irish national theatre, and he wanted to put on these plays about the origin of Ireland. And it was before Ireland attained, it was before 1916. So the theatre house was opened in 1904.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it was to create an Irish national movement, which had already begun, and it had been going on for almost 100 years. But Yeats really did have a huge impact on the whole notion of what it meant to be Irish. You know, yeah, despite being a Protestant, you know, and despite being from the aristocracy.
So, from this play
Yeah.
that you studied, where does the link come to Nietzsche?
Yeah, well, Yeats lectured on Nietzsche before he opened the play, before he opened the theatre house, the Abbey Theatre in Dublin. He would lecture on that book, on Nietzsche's book.
Which one?
His first book, The Birth of Tragedy.
Oh, yeah.
So in German it's called Die Geburt der Tragödie aus dem Geist der Musiker. So the birth of tragedy from the spirit of music.
Wow.
And so the book is Nietzsche's first book. I think he was 25 when he wrote the book. And it was dedicated to Wagner's wife, Cosima Wagner. And it was given to her as a birthday present on her, it was either a birthday or a Christmas present in 1876, yeah. And Wagner performed the Siegfried Idyll on that day. Yeah, so Siegfried is the German national hero. Siegfried is Germany, and Cuchulainn is Ireland. And so the Siegfried Idyll is before Wagner had written the Ring Cycle, so he was already thinking of Siegfried then. And Nietzsche's book is about the ancient Greek theatre and it's about the Oedipal tragedies as well as comedies, and it's quite it's a lot. It's a very rich book, although it's very short. It's hard to sum up, but it's about the original tragic theatre house in ancient Greece, pre-Socratic Greece, and the role of the theatre house in bringing people together, and that Dionysian spirit. And then the end of the book is really about how Wagner, with his music, has recreated this in the modern time. And then Nietzsche says in the book, the German knight that has lain asleep in a cave for so long is now waking from his slumber.
German knight who has lain asleep
in his cave for so long.
He's awaking from his slumber.
Yeah, he believed that Wagner was opening the door to a national revival of the spirit of the Germans, which is exactly what Yeats wanted to do.
Were they successful in awakening that spirit?
In Ireland?
In Ireland, in Germany?
Well, one of my friends at university, he said to me that the Dionysian spirit that Yeats and Nietzsche and Wagner were dabbling with is like opening a Pandora's box, and you can't control what comes out of it once you open it. And Yeats was shocked by what happened in Ireland in 1916. He said the nightmare rides upon sleep, famous line in poetry, about 1900, his poem's 1919. So it's 3 years after the Easter Rising, and it's now into Ireland's civil war, which lasted for 4 years.
What was the Easter Rising?
The Easter Rising was the uprising in Dublin, where the proclamation was read out that Ireland was establishing itself as a free state and as a republic, independent of Great Britain. So it's the first active, first successful anti-colonial uprising in the British Empire, and the first revolution of the 20th century, before Russia, before all the monarchies of Europe and Turkey fell. Like that decade, within 10 years, Ireland had become independent, and then Russia withdrew from, a year later, Russia withdrew from World War One, and the Kaiser was soon executed. Then Germany was forced to lose World War One. They didn't actually lose, but they were forced to lose World War One.
Kaiser was executed?
No, the Kaiser was forced into abdication. The Tsar of Russia.
Yeah.
And then the Ottoman Empire was destroyed. The Kingdom of Greece, there was a communist revolution, 1924. The Greek royal family came to Britain and America. So there was it's a Pandora's box. The 20th century, you could say, it was a time of war. Yeah. It was bloodshed, widespread conflict. And so this was something that Yeats said, did a certain play I wrote, Send Out Men, the English Shot.
Wow. So Nietzsche said that Wagner is opened the door towards reawakening the German spirit.
Yeah.
And Yeats wanted to replicate this in Ireland with the Irish spirit, with the Irish people.
Yes. Yeah, I've never met a single person from Ireland who didn't know who Yeats was.
Right.
Yeah.
But
they didn't love Yeats as well.
Didn't love, yeah, exactly. But
and he was very controversial.
Was he?
He was very controversial. Like, he became a senator in the Irish Republic. So after all that, although he was shocked by the fighting that took place, many people left Ireland because of it. He said in 1919, many ingenious, lovely things are gone. And then he goes on to say, the nightmare rides upon sleep. A drunken soldiery can leave a mother murdered at the door to go scot-free. The night will sweat with terror as before we pieced our thoughts into philosophy and tried to bring the world under a rule, who are but weasels crouching in a hole. So, yeah, he was disgusted by what happened in Ireland.
And is this?
But he still became a senator.
Right.
The
thing is, I don't know about the history of Ireland, so at all. So I don't know. I mean, you mentioned 1913, 1916. What actually happened? What was happening there? Because 1916 for me is like Middle of the First World War.
Yeah, the Somme in July, I think, or June 1916.
Mm-hmm.
But in Easter 1916, the Irish rose up. It wasn't all the Irish, but those around the 16 leaders. They started a rebellion based in Dublin, and then it spread across. They had units across the country who took over the local government. In Dublin, they targeted the post office. They shut off communication, and they declared themselves an independent state. It's very tactical. We were talking earlier about tactics and revolution.
It sounds just like Trotsky and
very similar to
the
Trotsky.
Russian Revolution.
Yeah. There were 16 leaders of the 1916 rising.
Right.
They were all killed. There was only one man who wasn't killed, Eamon de Valera, who became the president of the Irish Republic. And he was president through World War II. So he was president for about 20 years.
Oh.
So they rose up against the British. And then the British army, Ireland was part of Great Britain. It wasn't separate. It had been part of Great Britain for hundreds of years, since the Norman conquest. So, and some of the best British army regiments are Irish regiments. They still are, like the Royal Irish Hussars. The British Army on the Rhine was almost all, in Germany during the Cold War, was almost all Irish regiments.
Wow.
Yeah. Northern Irish regiments. So Northern Ireland is still part of the United Kingdom.
Right.
But the Republic, so it's the rest of the country, is independent. And it took a long time for it to be, it wasn't successful overnight. You know, like the British executed all those leaders. They forced them out of the post office. They won in Dublin.
Wow.
But then the fighting carried on. And eventually Ireland became independent. They executed all the leaders of the uprising.
Wow.
You know, and but then there was a negotiated withdrawal of British troops from what became the Republic of Ireland. It took a while.
So the British were busy executing and fighting the Irish while the Battle of the Somme was happening.
And most of the regiments that were mobilised in Dublin, they were all men who were too old to be fighting in the Western Front or wounded.
Oh, wow. So this is all while
these are all the old boys.
But there's all a bunch of Irish men in the trenches of the First World War.
And there were still Irishmen there. Yeah, exactly. And the regiments that are mobilised also, they were Irish fighting Irish. You know?
So then what happened next?
Well, there was a civil war. The Irish Civil War.
I really don't know anything about any of this.
Yeah, well, it went on until, I think, 1924.
Wow. Oh, so there was all of this stuff happening in Ireland in the early 20s. And Yeats was a part of this?
Yes.
What was his role?
National poet. His role was a poet. He died in 1939.
Okay.
And he was at a grand old age when he passed away. I think he was born in 1865.
Okay.
But he said in this poem, to Ireland in the coming times, is, while still may I write for you the land I loved, the dream I knew. So he loved Ireland.
Yeah.
He goes, I know that I would accounted be true brother of a company that sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong, ballad and story, ran and song, nor be I any less of them. So he saw himself as one of the poets of Ireland, singing, what does it say? To sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong. Yeah, that sang to sweeten Ireland's wrong, nor be I any less of them. And then it goes on, it goes, while still may I write for you. Don't know who he's addressing. It could be one person, it could be the land, it could be anyone who reads the poem, it could be the Irish people. The land I lived, the land I loved, the dream I knew. You know?
So did he spark the revolution?
No.
You quoted that line of the poem.
He knew all those people personally who did. He knew all of them personally. He socialized with them. A lot of them were from very high society. I think he was in love with a woman who was married to one of the leaders as well.
But no, you mentioned that he wrote that poem where he was almost taking the blame for it.
I don't know where that is. If it's a poem or it is a poem. It says, did a certain play I wrote send out men the English shot? So
was he taking responsibility?
He did, yeah, he did. He did.
But was it him? Was it him that sparked it then?
Well, the Abbey Theatre was like it was like a pit of energy in Dublin.
Mm.
You know, there were big crowds that would come. They struggled to begin with, and Yeats's plays had a sort of, they weren't all successful. You know, they didn't always hit it with the audience, but they had big audiences. You know, they'd have riots in the theatre as well. People would riot because they thought that this was anti-Catholic. You know, and the Catholic Church didn't like what they were doing.
Right.
So they would tell people, they sort of stoke up tension. You know, but he was living out the sort of the philosophy in that book, in Nietzsche's book, The Birth of Tragedy. He was trying to put it into action,
which was the replication or the revival of the Greek theatre.
Yes, he even wrote his own version of Oedipus Rex.
But he's not really known for his plays.
No, but he put a lot of time into them, a lot of energy into them. But it's just, yeah, I suppose it's just a sign of the time we live in that he's not remembered for his plays. They're not very popular anymore. So
how could one reawaken the flame of Yeats in the contemporary time?
Well, I think we should follow out what he said. He said, my theatre will be the ancient theatre. All you need is a rug and a staff and a cloak. And you'll be able to do it. You can do it under a tree or in a drawing room of a nice house. He's given it to us. All you need is the play and 3 people to perform it. You don't need anything else.
How long is the play?
They're very short. They're very short plays.
So how long would it take to perform?
45 minutes maximum. They're all 1-act plays.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So why don't we do it?
Yeah, we should do it. Let's do it.
How many? We need 3 people.
We need 3 people. Yeah. And a good enough room.
But does it have to be live, or could you actually record it and do it as just a?
Well, I think nowadays, I'm sure you could get away with recording it.
So it
should be live though.
Well, let's do both.
Yeah.
Let's do a live performance that's recorded. Who's going to be number 3?
Who's going to be number 3? We'll put an ad out.
If anyone wants to be number 3 in a performance, a spontaneous performance of W.B. Yeats
on Bailey Strand.
On Bailey Strand, send me a message.
Right, we'll see who gets back to us.
What fun! I want to really, because I know you're passionate about Yeats, and he's like one of your kind of heroes almost. And I want to just go deeper into Yeats, because I only know 2 or 3 of his poems, and I really don't know anything about him. And why was he so significant? I mean, other than the fact that he produced this beautiful poetry, but like the man himself, who was he? How would you describe him?
Well, I'd say he was a man of passion. He did everything with passion.
What does that mean?
Well, with Yeats, it means that he was a writer, but he also saw himself as having a social duty. That's why he became a senator at the end of his life, and that's why he wrote for his country, for his land, not for his country, but for his land, for his people. And he dabbled in all kinds of things because he believed that human being. He didn't just believe in his poetry; he believed in a whole other world of fairies and ghosts, and spirits, whole unseen world that was on his side.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and he was very passionate. He really believed in it, and he dabbled in all kinds of weird things,
like
weird stuff, like seances and things like that.
Oh right, yeah. Oh, he was into all of that.
Yeah, and automatic writing. So he had a wife his wife did automatic writing.
Yeah.
which is where you almost there's something else telling you what to write, and you're just writing it. You don't think, what should I write? You just write what's coming to you.
Have you done it before?
I haven't done it before.
It's amazing. That is amazing. It's so much fun. And you know what? The amazing thing about it is not when you're writing it, you just write. There's actually a video on my Instagram, I think, of me doing it. So a friend of mine just filmed me on slow-mo.
Right. I thought that was just how you write.
No,
that was you writing.
That was me writing, but that was automatic writing.
Oh, wow.
That was just like...
Yeah. But no, it was much more esoteric for Yeats. I hate to use that word to refer to him.
Right, but in what way?
In that he really believed in this ancient, he believed in like, that there was this ancient tradition of wisdom.
Mm.
There was a society called the Golden Dawn that he was affiliated with at some point, but I don't know the details, so I don't want to say how far or what he did. But there was this, he believed that from the time of Babylon and like Pythagorean Greece, that there was always a tradition of knowledge that had been passed on. And that the poets also inherited this knowledge and they passed it on as well. So he didn't believe that poetry was just rhyming and writing and expressing yourself. He believed it was actually being part of an ancient tradition that had a responsibility to teach men beauty and to teach them the truth.
Wow.
And in his last poems, he talks about this. He says, "Swear by what the sages spoke round the Mareotic lake, that the witch of Atlas knew." So there's something, Atlas is ancient times. That the witch of Atlas knew spoke and set the cocks a crew. Swear by those women, by those horsemen, complexion and form are superhuman. So this is a bit of Nietzsche coming in. That pale, long-visaged company, the heirs in immortality, completeness of their passion won. Now they ride the wintry dawn, where Ben Bulben sets the scene. Here's the gist of what they mean. And this whole poem goes on, and it ends with the really famous 3 lines that's inscribed on his grave. And he's buried under Ben Bulben. Under Ben Bulben was this hill. You need to look it up. Anyone listening to this has to look up a photo of it. It's got a very distinctive shape. Ben Bulben. Aye.
Great.
And it's a great hill. When you look at it, you think, magnificent hill. And an ancestor of his was a rector there in one of the churches, and he's buried there. He says, "Cast a cold eye on life, on death, horsemen pass by." That's how the poem ends. But it's in 5 different sections, and it's all about this thing that he believed was being transmitted through the generations, and that had to be carried on. It goes completely against what most people are taught in school. So it's not even any point in trying to go into it and explain it to try and explain it would actually ruin it. But it was this ancient wisdom that he believed in that went right through from the beginning of humanity, and that had to be carried on. And that he felt poets were a part of that, And that's why he said that he believed in the ancient theatre. He wanted to revive a kind of a ritual, And in that poem, he says, "Bring the souls of man to God." Yeah, he said, talking to people, like he's saying, poet and sculptor do the work. Bring the souls of man to God. Make them feel the cradles right.
This is amazing. Right?
Yeah, so it is amazing.
But I had no idea who the man was, and it's like he was tapping into a well.
That's the perfect thing to say, yeah.
And allowing whatever was underneath it just to come up.
Because he also wrote books. He wrote a book where he interviewed people in the peasantry in Western Ireland who he believed were a whole race of people that just knew all this. Everyone knew it. They didn't talk about it, but everyone knew about this. Like about the fairies and about spirits and things that are passed on in the human gene pool, or that you could say that are ancestral, that are inherited, even faces, that, if you look at pictures of people from 100 years ago, I saw that person on the tube yesterday. or even 400. You look at like the Dutch paintings, the portraits, and you think, I saw that guy in Hackney. It's like a hipster. Yeah.
Amazing, eh? But it is this thing of tapping into the ancient soul.
The ancient soul.
Or that part, that's what, in the episode on the Wolfgang, see, Dr. Ali Azali is talking about, Ernst Junger's essay, The Wolfgang, and how, like, that is the journey. The journey is to get there, to get into that deepest part of your spirit, in order to allow your humanity to arise and overflow out of you as this Wolfgang, as this free spirit. And I mean, like, so with my my journey with my life coach, and it's all been that, is all, how do you tap into the well that is inside every single human being? How do you get to it? How do you find it and then tap into it and allow it to flow up and emerge and like overflow out of you?
Yeah, well, I always thought that when I read the Wolfgang, when Ernst Junger talks about how the poets are people that poetry has that liberating effect. I always thought, yeah, that's what Yeats has. That he's a true poet. He's a real poet.
Amazing. Tell me more. Give me more. This is amazing. Like, I just, give me more. Keep going. Just tell me anything. I don't care.
There was a lady who was very important in Yeats' life called Lady Gregory. She was his patron. So she looked after him. She enabled him to live his own lifestyle while he was especially when he was a young writer. She knew he was talented. And she was the co-founder of the Abbey Theatre with Yeats. And her son was an airman in the Royal Flying Corps for Great Britain during World War One.
Yeah.
And he was killed his plane was shot down.
Wow.
He was a very young man. And Yeats wrote a poem about him called An Irish Airman Foresees His Death. And it's a brilliant poem. It's taught in schools a lot. A lot of people know this poem.
Okay.
And it starts off, if I can remember it, it goes, I know that I shall meet my fate somewhere amid the clouds above. Those that I fight I do not hate. Those that I serve I do not love. And because Nietzsche had this idea of the love of fate, amor fati, and Yeats's idea of tragic joy, which is the joy of the dying hero on the stage, is a joy because they're also submitting to their fate. It's a very interesting idea. It's a very interesting idea. So tragic joy is the joy of the hero at the moment of their tragic destruction.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So there's no suffering. There's no self-pity.
Oh.
There's no moaning. There's no talk of the suffering. Right? And this is actually perhaps Nietzsche's largest influence on the 20th century. Because Nietzsche was a man of great suffering. But he hated the victim worship of Christianity and the inversion of values that he believed Judaism had created in response to their own suffering. So their suffering and humiliation under the Romans became an inversion of values, so that the Romans had to be the evil ones. The Romans who were stronger had to therefore be more corrupt. Strength had to be corruption. Victory had to be cheating. And true victory would only ever be in some promised future rather than in the present.
Oh.
Right? So, but Nietzsche hated this, and that's why he wanted there to be a transvaluation of values, of all values. And that actually is his largest influence, because if you look at modernism, you look at the great writers of the 20th century, they were all influenced by this point of Nietzsche. And so there was a Nietzschean moment, which is a sort of transformation of self-pity, like D.H. Lawrence saying, "I never saw a wild thing feel sorry for itself." You know, and Yeats himself in 1935, he edited the Oxford Book of Modern Poetry, published by Oxford University Press, 1935. It contained over 300 poems of people from his generation, and he said that, you know, he's calling his contemporaries modern. But he said that with regards to the World War I poets, he said it's better for someone who had survived the war to forget about their suffering in the way that someone forgets their illness. You know, when someone recovers from a fever, you forget it and you remember that moment of great relief when you've come back to health.
Amazing.
Right? Rather than to write about the suffering, you write about that joy of returning to strength and vigor.
Right. I need to plug a book. Right. So I'm going to plug a book into this episode. Madhouse at the End of the Earth. And this is a book about a Belgian voyage into the Antarctic, where they get stuck in the ice, and of the 18 men on board, 16 of them pretty much go absolutely bonkers. They're stuck in the ice through winter and through summer, so they have a 7-week night in the heart of winter and a 7-week day in the heart of summer, all stuck in the ice. And of all the sailors on board, 2 of them stay sane pretty much and without really getting that sick through this whole period of 14 months stuck in the ice. One is the doctor, who sees everything that he's doing as almost an experiment of what happens to the human creature in this extreme environment. And so he's constantly busy with his journal entries, observing all of the different sailors and what's wrong with them, and trying to find cures with whatever he has at hand. And he's absolutely magnificent through it all. And the other one is this adventurer who refuses to see anything as bad. There's moments where they go out on the ice and they almost fall into a crevasse, and he goes on this adventure across the ice and almost dies twice. And he writes in his journal, is like, that was such an amazing adventure. I hope I have more like that. And while they're all complaining about the food, they've been eating this strange canned food for like months on end. And every time he writes, the food today was marvelous. The food today was prepared to perfection. And there's a point at which everyone gets scurvy, and the doctor realizes that the only way to heal from the scurvy is to eat raw penguin or raw seal. And all of the other sailors are complaining about it. It's so disgusting. It tastes like rotten fish and all of these things, and it's just absolutely foul. And he writes in his journals, today the penguin was cooked to perfection. What wonderful penguin we ate for lunch, etc., etc. And through his positive view of what was around him, through extreme suffering, he comes out perfectly fine. And this guy, Roald Amundsen, he went on to become the first man to go to the North Pole and the South Pole. So he's something in the being, and these are the 2 figures that through this whole ordeal survived and stayed sane and didn't go mad. So thank you, Julian Sancton, and get yourself a copy of Madhouse at the End of the Earth. Links in the description below.
Well, what you just said actually reminds me of Storm of Steel.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It reminds me of this one moment, I really enjoy it, where Ernst Junger, he's lieutenant of a group of about 70 German shock troopers, and they were engaged in a fight with this English battalion that were dug in this trench. But the English were completely cut off, there were 70 or 80 of the Germans had pretty much encircled them. And the English captain came out to declare that they'd surrendered to Ernst Jünger. So he came up to Ernst Jünger and he shook Ernst Jünger's hand. And Ernst Jünger said, I knew that I was dealing with a real man.
Mm.
And then the English were then all rounded up and taken away as prisoners. And Ernst Jünger then said that we plundered the dugout, the officers' dugout. And he said, I took like English Navy cut tobacco, chocolate, and English jam, and Scottish woolen socks.
Mm.
And it's sort of like all that suffering, and then this small moment of, preserved food and Navy cut tobacco becomes this moment of like heroic joy.
That's amazing, because it's also like Beethoven and Wagner, that there were also these giants that had to suffer massively, but they refused to see suffering as an excuse almost. They continued doing what they were doing, and they continued to produce these absolute masterpieces.
It's like that scene in Money Heist where the professor is speaking to his brother Berlin in one of these flashbacks in the last season, and he says to Andres' brother Berlin, he says, look, how long do you have to live? He says, the doctors are telling me 7 years, 6 or 7, like the life of a wild cat. And then he says, well, Andres, you don't want to risk getting locked up in prison for the last few years of your life. We don't have to do this heist. And then he says, no, my brother, look, if you knew a painter who only had 3 years left of his life, would you tell him to stop painting? And then he says, look at Michelangelo. And they turn over to the statue. And he says, what would you say to him? You'd have said, Forza, Michelangelo, continua with your passion, carry on with your passion. Yeah. Amazing. And he says that about beauty, create beauty for the world. And then he says this heist is an apologia for beauty. But this is actually the thing that I ended my dissertation on. So in Nietzsche's view on tragedy and in Yeats's view on tragedy, the hero is destroyed. And Yeats still sees this as an opportunity for joy, because for Nietzsche it's the love of fate. But in Dr. Dallas's play, in Oedipus and Dionysus, Oedipus isn't destroyed. Yeats wrote his own Oedipus play, because he believed that the Oedipus plays that were around at the time just didn't hit it.
Right.
They didn't hit it on the stage. So he rewrote it so that every single line was something that a man could say in some kind of rage or fit of passion. Something that would be words that were straight to the point. But his focus was more on you could say, on the delivery of the play. Whereas in Dr. Dallas's play, the ending of the play is rewritten, completely rewritten. So that Oedipus, the real Oedipus, leaves with his wife, and they leave the palace and they walk under the trees. Whereas the fake Oedipus is put in place by Dionysus, lets them go, and he puts in place the pretend Oedipus for the masses, for the crowd, that goes out onto stage and is destroyed in front of them, tears out his eyes, just like Cuchulainn fighting the waves, but he in his armor with his heavy sword, and he goes under the waves, he's gone. So that to me is much more interesting, that the hero doesn't have to be destroyed, that there's a way to live.
It's the end of the 10 symphonies. Gorka Konig disappears, and there are 3 or 4 suspected ends, but they're just left there as it could have been this, it could have been that, or it could have been that, or it could have been something completely different. And it's just left there very open. But it's interesting because I was thinking about Wagner's Ring Cycle, and it's a tragedy. And at the end of it, everyone dies. All of the main characters die. But in a way, it's a tragedy, but their deaths aren't tragic, because everything is leading up to Brunhilde's final act of the highest sacrifice, which is she kills herself, but she jumps into the fire in order to destroy the ring with her, so that nobody else can take on the curse of the ring. But in that act, and giving the gold back to the Rhine maidens, putting the gold back to where it belongs in nature, she allows for a complete reset and the beginning of a new cycle. Read it out. Well, it says here, it says, Brunhilde is the first person who takes the ring into her possession and wills consciously not to possess it. It is by her act that the cyclical life pattern is allowed to revolve again and the natural life flow can continue. In the nature of the will to power, maximum power must be sought again and the story reenacted. Remember, neither Wagner nor Nietzsche is a utopian. There is no naive dream of a happy ending life on earth with everyone walking around in a stupor of goodness and exaltation. Then goes on to say, leaving aside the disaster of the universities and their historical achievement in halting utterly the philosophical discourse, children's education at home and in the school is a recipe for human tragedy. This is devastating. Book plug number 2, 10 Symphonies of Gorka Konig. But I like that tragic joy, because there's a joy in fulfilling your destiny. And if your destiny is to be the tragic hero, then it's like there's a you can accept it, and there's acceptance in it.
Both Nietzsche and Yeats referred to Shakespeare's tragedies as well. And Yeats wrote this poem, it's called Lapis Lazuli, and it says, it starts off, I've heard hysterical women say that they're sick of the palette and the fiddle bow, of poets that are always gay. For everybody knows, or else should know, that unless something drastic were to be done, aeroplane and zeppelin will come out and pitch like King Billy bomb balls in until the town lie beaten flat. So he's saying that art shouldn't be for art's sake. Art shouldn't have a spiritual message. It needs to be political. It needs to be relevant, quote unquote. Yeah. And then he says, all perform their tragic play. There struts Hamlet, there is Lear, that's Ophelia, that Cordelia. And though the tragic scene be there, the great stage curtain about to drop, they do not break up their lines to weep, though Hamlet rambles and Lear rages upon 100,000 stages. Yeats very clearly understood that the man and woman of our time, they have to transfigure their suffering. It has to go through like a metamorphosis. It has to change. It has to be something that changes them, but not into someone that's full of pity and grief, but it's someone that's full of joy, and because they've overcome whatever it was they had to go through. And that's the Wolfgang as well. That's the Wolfgang, because freedom is not given to you by the state. Freedom is something that you have to find yourself.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New Nomos podcast. This is another one of those episodes conversing with an expert on a subject that I have absolutely no idea about. So it was so invigorating and just wonderful to share in Edward Chessun's passion of W.B Yeats and leave feeling inspired by the example of this man's life, this great man's life, and the themes that we discussed, which are so relevant to everyone today. And so once again, thank you.